From soldier to peacemaker, Ethiopia's Prime Minister is awarded the Nobel Prize for helping to end the conflict with neighbouring Eritrea. But why isn't the Eritrean leader honoured as well? And what message does Abiy Ahmed's win send? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Stan Grant. The relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea could be summed up in two words: war and peace. They fought a 2-year war over a disputed border region 20 years ago. At least 100,000 people were killed. A tense military standoff followed. But last year, things changed. Ethiopia's new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, agreed to accept an international ruling that sided with Eritrea on the border dispute. Then he launched a peace initiative with the Eritrean leader, Isaias Afwerki. That resulted in diplomatic relations being restored. On Tuesday, Abiy Ahmed received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, but some have questioned that decision, not least because the honour was not extended to President Isaias Afwerki. We'll bring in our guests in just a moment. First, though, here's our diplomatic editor, James Bayes.
This was recognition of a man who's only been in office for 20 months. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali praised for changing Ethiopia in that time, releasing thousands of political prisoners and putting the country on a more open path. But the committee that gives the award was determined to make one thing clear to the new leader of a country that in the past has been led by kings, strongmen and dictators.
By awarding you the Nobel Peace Prize, we were not expressing an opinion on how or if you should lead the Ethiopian people in the future. The leadership of Ethiopia and its political platform must be decided by Ethiopian people and the Ethiopian people alone.
She said Prime Minister Abiy was the main architect of the peace with Eritrea, and this was not a joint award. There was still more work to be done between the two countries.
At present, this work seems to be at a standstill. It is the hope of the Norwegian Nobel Committee that your previous achievements, coupled with the added encouragement of the Peace Prize, will spur the parties to further implementation of the peace treaties.
But after accepting the prize, the new Nobel laureate made it clear he felt he was also accepting it on behalf of his Eritrean counterpart, Isaias Afwerki.
I accept this award on behalf of Ethiopians and Eritreans. Likewise, I accept this award on behalf of my partner and comrade in peace, President Isaias Afwerki, whose goodwill, trust, and commitment were vital in ending the 2-decade deadlock between our countries.
The speech continued in a tone of humility from a leader who started from the most humble beginnings and worked his way up through the military ranks after fighting in the war with Eritrea as a young soldier. His aides say that reserve was the reason too for declining all media interviews in Oslo, a decision that caused some controversy. But he may need more than humility for his next task. In 2018, he was installed as Prime Minister when his predecessor resigned. Next year in May, he'll face an election campaign for the first time. James Bayes, Al Jazeera.
Let's bring in our guest now. Joining us on Skype from Frankfurt, Tsedale Lemma, journalist and Editor-in-Chief of Addis Standard, focusing on Ethiopian news and politics. In London, Selim Kadani, human rights activist who specialises on Eritrea. And also on Skype from Cape Town, Sanusha Naidu. She's a researcher at the Institute for Global Dialogue, a South African think tank. Welcome to all of you. And I suppose I really should start with the obvious question here, Tsedale, and that's something that everyone asks when someone is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Are they worthy? In this case, is Abiy Ahmed a worthy recipient?
Thank you for the question. Allow me or indulge me to congratulate the Prime Minister before I started answering your question. Are they worthy? As controversial as the Nobel Peace Prizes are, I think for what the Prime Minister has achieved the first few months in the office, I would say they are worthy. But are they worrisome? It would be something that we may need to discuss in a later stage.
Yeah, we'll certainly get around to that. I know that Salam, you've already raised some concerns. I think it comes down to this, basically. Your position is that you may have a peace deal, you don't yet have peace. How can you win a peace prize?
True. Yeah, it's a question of perspectives, really, for me. I have a very Eritrean perspectives on this. I too think that Abiy Ahmed, in his time in office, has done some things that are worthy of an accolade, worthy of mentioning. The press freedom, freedom of association. I was there in Addis earlier last month, and I really appreciate some of what is going on there. But as the Peace Award is being given for peace with Eritrea, as an Eritrean, I cannot help but think, what peace? Where is the peace? Because from where we are in Eritrea, from where we look into, there is hardly any peace worthy of the mention.
And I want to come back to you on that point. I'll just go to Sanusha and just get your thoughts, Sanusha, here on whether this is an award that is an award for hope, for potential, for other things as well that Abiy Ahmed has done, rather than just the peace deal with Eritrea.
Yeah, I mean, thank you to you and the guests. And I think there have been some very important points raised by both my colleagues. Having gone through this process, I think in terms of Nelson Mandela winning the Peace Award as well, and looking at what the role was of Mr. Mandela in terms of the negotiations between what was a very fragile, if not brink of a internal civil war in South Africa, I think we have to recognize some of the achievements that he had made. And I suspect that's the issue at hand here, is the hope within which this award is being given, with the intention that it can lead to better, bigger, and more kinds of not just relative, but more kind of sustainable levels of stability, hoping that this would provide some kind of incentive. Obviously, there are challenges to an award like this. The expectation of receiving such an award and the intention that this award would essentially bring about more than just a relative peace or a kind of broad peace process, but rather a sustainable, viable process. I think with reflection, if I cast my mind back to our process in South Africa, we're still grappling with some of those structural issues as well.
And Tsedale, I suppose, you know, when you look at such a young leader, someone who has played a significant role also in Sudan, in brokering conflict between Kenya and Somalia, that is someone who has already cast quite a shadow over the region, establishing a very strong reputation at a young age and a young stage in his presidency, or prime ministership, rather.
I agree with you. And initially, he has, with vigor and with a seeming determination, set off changing the landscape of the Horn, the politics of the Horn of Africa, which is not an easy thing. Not only that he initiated the peace process with Eritrea, but we have not seen. I must mention here that some of his own initiatives in the Horn of Africa, his peace talk between Somalia and Kenya, for example, have been having some drawbacks after that. So he hasn't been following what he has started off initially. The same is true with the peace deal with Eritrea. I'm going to have to do a little bit of pushback here with what Salam said. Of peace within Eritrea. I think the Nobel Committee is recognizing the Prime Minister for the peace deal with Eritrea and not within Eritrea, as that is entirely the affair of the Eritrean government. And Eritrea is a fiercely independent and sovereign state. So we need to be able to cautiously separate whether there is peace within Eritrea or peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea. my opinion is that I do not think these two countries would be going back to that status of civil war that they have been into in 1998 and 2000. And I do hope that the status quo is not going to return back, the status quo of no peace, no war either. But that doesn't mean that there hasn't been, there has been a satisfactory advancement in the rapprochement so far. There's a lot of things to be done. The same is true for the Prime Minister's initiative in the Horn of Africa. He needs to follow through some of the things very seriously, and there have been some mistakes made in the process. So he would have to go back and look what he started off, how he started off, and how it is going, the process so far. We would have to wait and see.
Let's get a response to Selim from that. It's a reasonable point, isn't it, Selim? I hear your criticism that the Eritreans have not seen the peace dividend yet. But is that really Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's job? Is that the Nobel Prize Committee's job? Is that not a question for Eritrea?
Definitely. It goes without saying. There's a lot that needs to be done within Eritrea. That's fine, and it is a lot. We are dealing with one of the most brutal dictators that the world has seen. I would go as far as saying that. However, the reason why Eritrea allegedly shelved its constitution, the reason why thousands upon thousands of young people were conscripted into an indefinite national service, the reason why Eritrea couldn't hold scheduled elections, the reason why we have got so many prisoners, political prisoners, we were always told that was because of the status quo with Ethiopia, the no war, no peace, and then the war before that. And so that's why I'm saying that the peace inside Eritrea is inextricably linked to the peace with Ethiopia. And that's why I'm saying that, yes, I do recognize starts, and it was a good start. I do recognize initiatives, and I do recognize the role of the Prime Minister in initiating, in accepting the Algiers agreement. But a year and a half on, we haven't seen either the the agreements, what has been agreed and what is on the ground. There's no demarcation of the border, which was the cause for the war in the first place. There isn't, I mean, the border that was briefly open is shut, and we don't see any other peace dividends, whether it is economic, social, political, any other things. And there is this illusion to peace, but that doesn't mean anything given the fact that we didn't emerge out of war immediately before this peace accord. We actually emerged out of a situation where it was no war, no peace. And if you're an Eritrean young person sitting at the national service inside Eritrea, minding a trench that you have been minding for 20 years, nothing has happened. There hasn't been any difference. So that's why I was saying. And also, I mean, I do recognize starts, I do recognize potentials, but if there wasn't any mention of how far we've still got to go in the celebrations yesterday, and that's a disappointment.
On that basis, that there is a start here, there is an end to this conflict, and keeping in mind the 100,000 people who died at the height of the conflict, the people who've been displaced. Here's what the Nobel Committee chair said. Peace does not arise from the actions of one party alone. Abiy Ahmed has referred to Isaias Afwerki as his comrade in peace. Is there an argument, given that what we have seen, albeit, as you say, we have not necessarily seen the full fruits of that peace, but given the progress that's been made, is there not then an argument that this should have been shared?
Shared how? Shared...
a joint award, a joint Nobel Award.
It cannot be, because Isaias Afwerki hasn't shown any signs of change, any signs of actually being able to effect that peace. He hasn't demobilized the indefinite national service. They haven't demobilized the young people back to rehabilitate them. He hasn't made any progress by way of showing that now this is a peace era, that he can make the steps as a result of that peace, and I think it would have been such a mockery of the whole situation had Isaias Afwerki shared that accolade. I mean, for someone who thinks it was too early, too little has been done, the worst thing would have been to give accolades to Isaias Afwerki by sharing the award.
Yes, Tsedale?
Yeah, it's a very good point that Salam is making, in addition to what she has just spoke. I think we're going to have to also turn back our attention to Prime Minister Abiy himself, now that he's a Nobel laureate, and see what he has really done with his initiative with regard to pushing to institutionalize this peace process. We would have to see not just a failure from Isaias Afwerki's side, but also Abiy Ahmed's. I understand that Ethiopia is revising its foreign policy of the last couple of decades, and that we haven't seen the final document. And I understand that there could be some restraints from the Ethiopian side on how far it can get engaged with Eritrea, but we don't even know the basics, the meaning of the basic document that is signed. In the rapprochement, in Saudi Arabia. Yes, we do have a press release about that, but the Ethiopian public hasn't been discussing that as well. There is not any elite negotiation with the TPLF, which I think is a key partner in this as well, up in the north. There hasn't been any effort from the Prime Minister's side in engaging what kind of peace negotiation is he having with the Eritrea side there. So there's a lot to be desired here.
You've raised a lot of questions there. And I do want to come to those questions about Abiy Ahmed and what is expected of him now. But I just want to stay with this for a moment, Sanusha, and get your thoughts on how much credit can be given to Isaias Afwerki. Because we have seen in the past, and sometimes they've been controversial decisions, but we have seen in the past where the Nobel Prize has been jointly awarded because there were two sides to the piece. You've heard what both our other guests have had to say here. Do you have a different view on that, or do you also believe that in this case, given what's happening inside Eritrea, given the allegations against the authoritarian rule of Isaias Afwerki, that it would have been too far, a step too far, to award him jointly the Nobel Prize?
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating because both sides make very compelling arguments with regard to the position of a joint awarding the prize jointly to both individuals and the pros and cons of that. But again, when you look at the way in which these awards have been given out in the past, etc. Again, I come back to South Africa, and I think sometimes the question then would have been, in the case of both Ethiopia and the Eritrean side, is to what extent would have, before the award was given, could there have been some kind of negotiation around the space, particularly with regard to the Eritrean leader coming on board and maybe moving in some of the directions that both the colleagues have raised in showing commitment, intent, and even effect in terms of the kinds of reforms that need to take place. What I get the sense of is that this seems to have fallen by the wayside. Now, obviously, the structural conditions, environment between these regions are fundamentally different to where we were 25 years ago in South Africa, and the internal negotiated space and how much of the external played a role. And I think to a large extent, these are dynamics. I mean, again, the question is, it's not a sufficient condition just to get the award. It's what that award is supposed to be doing and how it's supposed to be incentivizing. Now, whether or not the Eritrean leader could he have received the award, as our colleagues rightly pointed out? Perhaps it's too soon. It was a mockery, etc. But we've just seen something very interesting with regard to the Myanmar leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, with regard to what's happening there, and an award that was given for her fight against the military dictatorship in Myanmar. But of course, now what's happening with the Rohingya people, a kind of retraction of that award. So again, for me, I think the bigger questions again is around what is the intention, and whether or not the Ethiopian president, as a prime minister rather, as well as the regional actors and the external actors, are able to push these spaces. It's not sufficient enough just for the award. It's about what kind of peace, durability, and sustainability can be achieved.
Salam, Sanusha raises a couple of really interesting points there. Of course, the reference to Aung San Suu Kyi, and now facing these these hearings around genocide, which shows, just how sometimes the expectation and winning an award like this, the expectations are not necessarily met. But she also raised something about South Africa. And when we saw de Klerk and Mandela jointly win an award, that also spoke to the relationship that was built around. Now, there is a close personal relationship, there appears to be, between these two leaders. Is that relationship, that personal relationship, going to be strong enough to bring about the reform in your country that you'd like to see?
Oh, I mean, certainly that was the hope for many. That's that. I mean, at best, it was what many people hoped for, and the thing is, these awards are either for results or for potential of results, and for a potential, you need to evidence it with the track record or with the steps that have been taken. And if you take the track record of Isaias Afwerki, we're talking about allegations of crimes against humanity, for instance, that have never been responded to. And then you've got that against the background that Eritrea has never, or the Eritrean regime, the regime in Eritrea has never responded positively to any attempts of trying to bring it round back to the negotiating table, back to formal processes of engaging the government and the people of Eritrea. So if we consider the results, it's early days, okay, there may be potentials, but then you need to see the realization of those potentials. Are there systems in Eritrea? Is there any plans to reform some of the systems that have made Eritrea become one of the worst offenders of human rights in our world today? So there isn't any evidence to suggest all that.
Tsedale, when it comes to that personal relationship, how did you feel when you've seen images before of Abiy Ahmed with his arm around Isaias Afwerki, when you heard the speech and, of course, talking about a comrade in peace, that personal relationship? You said you'd like to see this more institutionalised. How have you felt about that personal relationship and what that could deliver?
Well, there were times when, I had my skin crawling, particularly when, as you mentioned now, the hugs and all these fluffy talks on the stage in Addis, and the Prime Minister addressing President Isaias Afwerki by nickname Isu. We have had some, uncomfortable moments of the Prime Minister leading a foreign policy of his own country based on his personal trait. So there have been a lot of criticisms of that as well. And that is partly why people who are criticizing the non-advancement of the peace process today are mentioning it hinges on the personal relationship between him and President Isaias Afwerki. A lot can be done to improve that, and my Prime Minister, as I would call him often, needs to do a lot in moving away from conducting a personal diplomacy and institutionalizing that. And so it doesn't help his efforts that he's engaged more into this kind of relationship with a president, and there's nothing substantial on the ground. So I do hope that with the Nobel Prize for Peace now in his hand, he would be more of a statesman-like in engaging our neighbor Eritrea and in institutionalizing what has been done so far, than just having the entire relationship dangling based on his own personal characters, if I may put it.
Just a final thought from you, Sanusi, if I could. And unfortunately, I have to hold you to about 30 seconds. But what are the hopes here for Africa with a young leader receiving an award such as this? There are some concerns about some of the hardline measures he's taking inside his own country. He's facing elections next year himself that could also be problematic. But what are the hopes broadly in Africa after this award?
I think one of the things that perhaps is something we need to think about very seriously in Africa is young leaders. We don't have perfect leaders. We don't necessarily have leaders that are, kind of coming from an end where they are not necessarily grappling with their own kind of leadership crises in terms of a domestic or whatever. But what we need to see is them taking the initiative. And hopefully this is part of the way in which we can actually recalibrate even the AU in terms of the leadership and the kinds of young leaders that come into the fold in Africa and bring more innovative leadership and governance to the continent.
It's been a pleasure to speak to all of you on the program. Tsedale Lemma, thank you so much for your time. Selim Kadani and Sanusha Naidu, thank you so much. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. From me, Stan Grant, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.